Tell me about a scary situation in your life when you suddenly realized it was time to get out right now. I was walking with my sister in a local park. We got there around 3 o'clock and wandered around until 9:30, when we saw three guys in identical clothes on the other side of the park. I noticed them right away, but didn't pay them any serious attention. We walked for another 2 minutes, and I noticed that one of them stopped and stared at us. I immediately got an uneasy feeling, and I told my sister we had to get out of here. She understood immediately, and we got the hell out of there. Later that night, there was a breaking news report of a stabbing in the park. The suspects were the three guys we saw. About 20 years ago, as a teenager, riding home on my bike from a friend's house, we all kind of lost track of time and stayed out late. So I'd come back when it was already dark. I lived about a couple of kilometers from my friend's house. As I turned onto one of the roads leading to the house, I suddenly got a strange feeling. I look back and I see headlights. Some kind of car stops at an intersection and slowly turns onto the road I'm driving on. Along this road, there are almost no houses, lights, and so on. As soon as they turned, I immediately darted into the woods and hid somewhere far away from the road. The car slowed down, passed me, and moved on. I have no idea what they wanted, but I had no desire to get involved. A year ago, we had Hurricane Florence in our state. We had planned to get out for a walk on the hill and in places where we didn't expect high winds. Oh, and for the most part, we didn't pay attention to the news warning. The night before the hurricane, I got an extremely uneasy feeling in my stomach and started begging my dad to go to my sister's house, who lived a couple hours from the sea. We even fought about it, but I eventually convinced him. We returned a week after the storm and saw a tree fall on our house, which was also flooded. A tornado had formed behind the house in the woods, which dropped the tree onto the roof of our house. After that incident, I always trust my gut, no matter how silly it seems. When I was a kid, some guy came up to me and started asking me how to get somewhere. I started trying to explain the way, when suddenly I saw a van pull up with the side door open. I immediately ran as fast as I could and didn't look back. Was at a hangout with the Chevs, who suddenly told the guests to keep hanging out in the basement. They were smiling, but talking with aggression. Most of my buddies and I left right away. But there was one of us who decided to stay. He ended up getting robbed. A few years ago, my boyfriend had his own tire company. One day, he went into a customer's house unannounced to have them write a check because they owed the company a large amount of money. Upon leaving the house, he was a bit agitated. He explained that there were many of the homeowner's brothers in the house, which is very unusual for him. That being said, everyone was very nervous. They wrote him a check anyway, and then quickly escorted him out. My boyfriend had a strange, anxious feeling that day. 2 days later, the client and his brothers were arrested for a murder they had committed the night before we arrived at their place. We once decided with a friend to go to the woods to set up a campsite. There weren't many in that area, and they were all very remote from each other. We would have spent one night there if the place had been fully prepared and equipped with everything we needed. But in the end, we had to look for everything we needed and set up. We drove to the nearest town for food, and as we were returning to our cozy little campsite, we met a man on the road. We crossed eyes with him and immediately felt uncomfortable. He looked at us with eyes full of hatred, as if we were his enemies. But we had never seen him before in our lives. When we got back to the camp, we saw things scattered everywhere. Our bags were lying around the tent. Our clothes were scattered. Immediately, 2 hunting knives were missing, plus some of our clothes were missing. We immediately had the thought in our heads that the man we ran into on the way to camp had done it, because this trail doesn't lead anywhere but our spot. We jumped in the car and drove back to where we saw him. But he wasn't there anymore. We drove a little farther and came across a general gathering place where other campers were hanging out. Well, we went out and asked them, "Did any of you guys see a man?" And we described him. The crowd of people just stared at us in silence, which made us cringe even more, and then I told my friend, we should go right now. As we walked back to the car, we saw all of our stolen clothes behind the fence. We quickly gathered up all the clothes, but there wasn't a single knife among them. Keeping in our heads that the guy was still there, that he had a knife with him, and that nobody was around us, we jumped in the car and quickly got away from there. There's no way we would have stayed in those woods overnight. That's the common sense I call out to people every time I watch camping horror movies. I'm telling you, These rituals are harmless. It was about 2 in the morning. We were sleeping in a top-floor apartment when we were suddenly awakened by the fire alarm going off. It was late, we didn't want to get up, and we thought it was a false alarm. Then I suddenly saw smoke seeping out from under the door. It was scary to imagine what was behind the door. We ran down the stairs, choking on carbon monoxide, and could barely see where we were running to. A horrible experience not to be forgotten. I'll keep the story in my head and try to take fire alarms more seriously. I was having a drink in a bar with some buddies in Sydney. 2 guys walked by, and I happened to make eye contact with them. One pulled out a gun, pointed it at me, and nodded towards the door. He didn't have to be told again. Freshman year of college, I went to a hangout. There were some questionable types there. The evening was getting really tense, but there were no fights or anything like that. As the night progressed, it became clear to me that something was up. I warned the college that it was time to levitate. No more than 5 minutes after we left, one guy got cut, and the guy who cut him got shot. What the fuck kind of college is this? I had my car stolen the same night we moved into a new house in a really nice neighborhood. Neighbors warned us that our neighborhood has been a little rough lately. Robberies have been happening periodically. They told us how recently a woman was robbed who opened her door when someone knocked on her house in the middle of the night. Unknown assailants attacked her, robbed her, and nearly killed her. Anyway, after the carjacking, we went straight to the police. A couple days later, in the middle of the night, I hear a knock on the door. Open up, police. Well, keeping the story of the poor woman's recent robbery in my head, I was wary and didn't answer anything. I took the kids, took them to a room from which I could enter through a window onto the roof. I then called the police and told them that 2 men were knocking on our house, posing as police. I was told there were no police in the area. They would send a car immediately. Turns out they were the same guys who stole the car and suddenly decided to come back. I got my car back. They brought it back with them. How nice of them. I hope they filled up a full tank. On vacation, I walked around a nature preserve. It was shaped like a crater with a path at the very edge that you can walk down almost to the end. I had a strong gut feeling that well, fuck off going down there. Later that day, I learned about a woman who died from being hit by something heavy when kids were throwing cobbles and branches down the slope. She was babysitting her child when suddenly she heard someone scraping something metal from the glass. I immediately hid the kids in the closet and called the police. We were about to get mugged or worse. With your lightning-fast reaction time, you must have saved a lot of lives. Good job. I was walking down a long road, no houses, just a cemetery. A van pulled up with 2 guys in it. They asked if I wanted them to give me a ride. This was in the late 90s when hitchhiking was not something legal and common. Well, I told them, no thanks, I was almost home. They kept up, driving behind me with the windows down and urging me, come on, hop in, come on. At some point they just stop and start getting out of the van. I was just a teenager, and they were in their 20s. I realized I had to flow. I think I stomped for about a kilometer until I got to the nearest alley and hid near the first building by the road. I waited for about 15 minutes and only then, after making sure they were behind me and not continuing to follow me, did I go home. Went on a second date with a guy. At one point he wanted to go over to his house to grab something and invited me in. He was really hot, but without knowing why, I felt some discomfort around him. We walked into his house and it was straight up creepy inside. The guy was loaded with money and the house itself was luxurious. It was spotless and absolutely sterile. There was nothing hanging on the walls. All the shelves were empty. There was nothing. No books, no CDs, nothing. I asked him how long he had been there and he said, 5 years. He walked into the kitchen for some reason and yelled at me to go into his room and get his keys from the top dresser drawer. A creepy chill ran down my spine, and I immediately moved closer to the front door. There was no way I was going to let him get between me and the exit. He asked me again to come into the room. I laughed and said, no dude, I'm so hungry, let's go. He asked again, with obvious irritation, and then I started to get stupid and whined about being hungry and why the hell he was taking so long. He got furious, and I left the house and walked down the sidewalk, and he had to follow me. We got to the car, and I kept playing the dumb chick and demanded he take me home. He did, and we drove in eerie silence. When he put the car in front of my house, he grabbed my face to kiss me goodbye. He bit my lips so hard it made me bleed. and then he slid his hand under my shirt and grabbed my nipple. Luckily, I shoved him off, fell out of the car, and ran home to his evil laughter. I ended up with bruises on my face and chest, a cut lip, and I was terrified that he knew where I lived. I'm pretty sure I escaped a serial killer attack. Sounds like the movie American Psycho. Yeah, that was one of the reasons I was so scared at his house. All I had in my head was that movie. One day on a hike, I saw a bear cub in the woods. I slowly turned around and took a quick step away from him. Didn't really want to get eaten. That said, I had to drag my friend by the scruff of the neck because he didn't understand why we were suddenly turning around and stomping back where we came from. You wouldn't actually get eaten, but his mother would definitely finish you off. The most dangerous thing you can meet in the woods is a bear cub. I remember one time my grandmother and I were driving down from the mountains and we saw a bear cub run out and stop in the road. He just stared at us and waited. Grandma hit the brakes and we stood up. After, maybe 5 minutes, the bear cub finally moved on, but Grandma sat unmoving. I asked her what she was waiting for. Why weren't we moving? She pointed out the side window. That's why. I looked out the window and saw a big old bear cub slowly stomping after her bear cub. Yikes, it was wildly scary, but at least we had a car and could steal away from there quickly. Thank you so much for watching. In the comments below the video, feel free to tell me about a scary situation in your life when you suddenly realized it's time to bail right now. Thank you for watching. Write in the comments what scary creep stories you have had. And don't forget to check out our other videos. Bye.